Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. Well, welcome to the tug-of-a-war season. Is it late winter or early spring? Will daytime highs be in the 60s and 70s? Or will the overnight lows dip below freezing? Or both? Deciduous fruit trees, your peaches, apples, plums, apricots, and a lot more in every part of the country get kind of confused when sunny, mild days are followed by a few freezing nights. And if those trees are blooming and a frost or freeze is predicted, you just might end up with fewer fruit to harvest this summer. So what's a gardener to do? We have tips to help you stave off the loss of those fruit tree flowers when temperatures get temporarily chilly. Also, do you know what regenerative gardening is? It's a great way to get a more bountiful harvest of food and flowers, and it's easy. In fact, you might already be a regenerative gardener without even knowing it. We talk with garden author Emily Murphy, who explores and explains that topic in her new book, Grow Now. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. We'll hear more from the dogs later on. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots, and we'll do it all in under 30 minutes. Let's go. We like to answer your garden questions here on the Garden Basics podcast. Joining us today, master gardener and the manager of Fair Oaks Boulevard Nursery in Sacramento, California. It is Quentin Young. And Q, we get an email from Jeremy, who lives in Anderson, California, which is in the northern end of the Sacramento Valley, about halfway between Redding and Red Bluff. And he probably has a beautiful view of both Mount Lassen and Mount Shasta. And he has a rather cold question. He says, what is going to be the effect of the freezing temperatures we've had in the valley lately on my fruit trees during bloom? We had a very warm January and February this year. This caused my fruit trees to bloom about 1 to 2 weeks earlier than normal. Towards the end of February, we had an unseasonable cold spell for a few nights with overnight lows around 28 degrees, while most of the trees were in full bloom. This caused many of the flowers to appear to die. What's the general impact on freezing during bloom? It's too late for me to do anything about it now. However, I was curious if I should have done something to protect the trees, knowing those cold temperatures were coming. Well, Q, you've had personal hands-on experience with similar questions like this as being one of the co-managers out at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center's orchard. You had to contend with basically the same situation.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, you did a great job of describing where this letter writer lived, because it really comes down to where do you live and understanding your microclimate. So at the Hort Center, we have a citrus row that's next to a fence. So to us, it's somewhat protected. We did not cover them this year. And then further into the orchard where it's a little bit warmer, we'll probably see a little bit of frost damage on the flowers, and those blossoms will fall off. And so that's just something you're going to have to deal with depending on where you live.
What is the end result? Does it mean no fruit or just a little bit of fruit coming up for the summer?
A reduction in yield, and that's just a general, it depends. Like I just walked through the nursery and I noticed that, for instance, some of the plums, even though they're in full flower, you can see some flowers that were frost damaged and they fall off as soon as you touch them. So they're not going to be producing fruit this year. But there's still quite a bit of very happy, healthy-looking flowers on the trees. So I think it'll be just a reduction in yield. But to me, that also means less fruit that you have to thin if you're going to properly thin your fruit later in the year.
Will that fruit tree try to set buds again, or is on fruit trees, on deciduous fruit trees, and that's what we're talking about here, not citrus, but deciduous fruit trees, is one blossom, is one bloom it for the year?
I would say you should expect that. I mean, you might be lucky. It might rebloom, but I wouldn't count on it.
All right, and you can't trick it into reblooming by lightly pruning it?
I mean, you could try, but depending on where you prune it, how lightly you prune it, you may end up just cutting off some more blossoms as well.
So, Jeremy, the first part of your answer would be good luck. Enjoy the few fruit you may get. Now, the second part of his question was, what can I do to stave that off, knowing that there might be colder temperatures in the future? And by the way, we're still in winter here in the Sacramento area. We've had frosts as late as the last week of March. And wherever you are in the country, you probably are in the same boat, just in a little different time frame. You may get surprise freezes in April or even May and have the same issues with your deciduous fruit trees. At the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center, Q, you've got size control going on. Those fruit trees are no more than 7 feet tall, so I imagine that eases the process.
It eases the process for covering them if you have to, and also eases the process for harvesting and fruit thinning. So if you know the weather's coming, the main precaution you can do is to cover your trees, to use the old C6, C7 Christmas lights. It just really depends on your setup and, again, your microclimate. Because here at the nursery, all my fruit trees and citrus trees are in a part of the nursery that are backed by a large stone wall. And so that releases heat during the night. So that gives me about 5 more degrees of protection because I know that that's how that works. So I know my own little microclimate.
And that's true for anybody who may be planting deciduous fruit trees this year. Is think about the various microclimates in your yard and think about areas where there may be reflected heat, especially a south or a west-facing wall that can add a little extra heat on those nights that get surprisingly frosty.
Exactly.
What about that cover that you mentioned? What sort of fabric works best on covering fruit trees to protect them?
So the industry name is usually Agribon is a really well known, and it comes in different thicknesses, 25, 50, 75%. But most nurseries, like here at Fair Oaks Boulevard Nursery, we just carry a nice, it's called frost cloth. It's, I think, a 12 by 10 square, so it's manageable. The nice thing about it, unlike, let's say, a blanket or a tarp, is you could leave it on for a couple of days at a time. It lets air and light through, unlike, let's say, if you had to use a comforter or a blanket at the last minute. And you want the shape of it to look like a ghost. So you want it to go over the plant all the way to the ground. You don't want it to look like a lollipop. You don't want to gather it all in at the base and let that radiant heat from the ground escape.
Yeah, frost cloths are great for letting light and air and rainwater pass through, and it comes in various weights. And I would think for a light frost, or even when temperatures are dropping down to 28 degrees for less than an hour or two, you could probably get away with a lighter weight frost cloth, but it probably pays to have several different weights handy.
Yeah, just have your backup, have your plan. Where are your frost cloth? Have them ready, and then just have your plan for when you're going to need them.
Let's stress one point, though. You mentioned to leave that frost cloth on for no more than a couple of days. Why is that?
Well, you don't want to leave it on, let's say, maybe longer than a week. You want the plant to get as much light as possible. If it's going to be flowering, you obviously want it to get pollinated. You don't want to end up bending the branches. There's a whole series of reasons, but I'd say anywhere between 3 to 5 days would be pretty good.
All right, and that should protect you. And again, by removing it during the day, it allows the surrounding soil as well to collect some heat and release that at night too.
Exactly, and that gets back to the whole, you want to drape that over the plant to capture as much radiant heat as possible.
And of course, a wetter soil is also a warmer soil.
Yes, and make sure your plants are well hydrated. A dried plant gets really stressed out from being frost damaged.
So basically, keep your fingers crossed, hope there are no late season frosts, and you'll have plenty of fruit to be picking this year.
Yeah, I think you should be fine, yeah.
Quentin Young is the manager of Fair Oaks Boulevard Nursery here in Sacramento, also a Sacramento County Master Gardener. One more thing, too. If you happen to be in the Sacramento area on Saturday, March 12th, the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center, which is run by the Sacramento County Master Gardeners, is having an open garden day from 9 a.m. to noon in Fair Oaks Park. You can just do an internet search for Fair Oaks Horticulture Center, and we'll all be there to answer your garden questions. 9 to noon Saturday, March the 12th, open garden at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center. Quentin Young, thanks so much.
Thank you, Fred.
I'm pretty picky about who I allow to advertise on this podcast. My criteria, though, is pretty simple. It has to be a product I like, a product I use, and a product I would buy again. And you know who checks all those boxes? It's Smart Pots. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Smart Pots are sold around the world, and they're proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots come in a wide array of sizes and colors and can be reused year after year. Some models even have handles, and that makes them a lot easier to move around the yard. Because the fabric breathes, Smart Pots are better suited than plastic pots, especially for hot climates. That breathable fabric has other benefits too. Water drainage issues? Not with Smart Pots. Roots that go round and round choking the root ball like they do in plastic pots? Doesn't happen with Smart Pots. These benefits will help you get a bigger, better plant than what you've gotten in the past with the same size plastic or other hard container. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers as well as select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how for a limited time you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED. F-R-E-D. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. You know, I thought I was finished writing about all the vegetables and flowers that were discussed in episodes 168 and 169 of the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, but no. For the fourth week in a row, the Garden Basics newsletter, Beyond the Basics, shines a light on award-winning flowers and vegetables that didn't get mentioned in the last three newsletters. So, in the latest newsletter, we're talking award-winning petunias, zinnias, begonias, eggplants, all of them All-America Selections winners, and there's a few gold medal winners in there too. Wherever you live, these plants will probably do well. It's in the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter, Beyond the Basics. Find a link in the podcast show notes or at farmerfred.com or by going to substack.com/gardenbasics. Think of it as your garden resource that goes beyond the basics. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred newsletter, and it's free. Please subscribe. Thank you. Growing a garden is one of the most powerful things we can do as individuals to enact positive change and make a difference. Those are the words of our guest today, Emily Murphy. She's the author of a couple of garden books, including Grow What You Love, 12 Food Plant Families to Change Your Life, and her latest book that just came out called Grow Now, Go Beyond Organic. If you've listened to this show for any length of time or the radio shows over the years, you know how I feel about gardening. It just helps you out as an individual. It makes you healthier. It widens your perspectives. It gets you more in tune with the rhythms of life. As a lot of people discovered when the COVID outbreak began a couple of years ago and a lot of people took up gardening, well, guess what? Here we are 3 winters later, and guess what? People are still gardening. That's right, because it's fun and it's healthy. And it's not only healthy for you, it's healthy for the environment as well. Emily Murphy's book, Grow Now, gets into a subject called regenerative gardening. And we'll talk about that in this interview about Grow Now. Emily, tell us a little bit about you first. Before we get into this, let's talk a little bit about Emily Murphy. You've been close to the land for quite a while.
Yeah, I have. I am one of those lucky people who was raised in couple of different environments, but close to nature in both. And when I was 7, I began living with my grandmother in the summers. My parents knew how much I loved it there, and they say, okay, that's what you want to do. You can stay with your grandmother. And the only rules at her home, which was the foothills of Sonoma County, where redwood trees meet oak woodlands, and it's just over the hill from the ocean. The only rules were to be home before dark and watch out for rattlesnakes. No shoes required. And sometimes I was there alone with her, and sometimes my cousins were there, and I would we would horseback ride and I had the best summer feet, swim. It was truly incredible. And she had this garden that she would tend in, and I would try to help her, but really I ended up just playing next to her when she was tending her garden and watch the butterflies and listen to her talk to herself as she was working along and chatting with me. And she had chickens. When I left her garden and walked out the gate, it was truly the wilderness. She was a mile up from a one street town, and it was a stark contrast, but it also made a lot of sense to me that these spaces that we tend and wild places they're not that different. Now our gardens aren't quite tame, but they're not quite wild, but we can do our best to make them wild, and they feed us in wonderful ways. And I learned this as a young person. If I didn't have the words for it, I learned it through osmosis because it carried me through all my years. And later in college, I studied ethnobotany and environmental science and soil science, ecology, social ecology, and was really lucky to do so because it sort of bookended those early experiences and brought me here many, many years later, gave me the foundation to work on this book, Grow Now.
If there's anything I rant on this program about, it's the benefits of compost and mulch, all of which feed the soil to increase that microbial activity in the soil. It's also something you talk about in your book, and you've labeled it regenerative gardening. And I would imagine there are some tenets of regenerative gardening that can be summed up very easily for the people listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Regenerative gardening is a term that is used to describe the process of growing that, well, first it uses a set of tenets that are so old they seem new. And I think many of these tenets are probably things many of your listeners are already doing. They possibly also watched their parents or grandparents or people they knew using many of these same practices because they're simple and effective. And the term regenerative, before we go on, the term regenerative is really a term that asks us to go beyond organic, to regrow, reassemble nature, and to use to the best of our abilities the principles that nature again uses to grow itself. And the idea is that it's no longer enough to be sustainable. The word sustainable, the root of sustainable, sustain, is to maintain the status quo. And when you consider where we are with the climate crisis and species extinction, loss of biodiversity, it's no longer enough to be sustainable. We're facing the extinction, the loss of over 1 million plant and animal species in the coming decades. That's 25% of life on Earth. Looking at that and knowing where we're headed with our wacky changing climate, but clearly it's no longer enough to be sustainable. Instead, we really need to look at regrowing, restoring, rewilding our landscapes, including our food systems and our veggie gardens. And what's fabulous is that the regenerative process is so incredibly simple, and it asks us to do just that, what you were mentioning, apply compost to our gardens, use mulch, use straw, any form of organic matter. And of course, different forms of organic matter are best applied in different situations, which we could talk about. But other tenets of regenerative growing, besides applying and protecting soil with compost and other mulches, is to take a no-dig approach or a no-till approach and disturb the soil as little as possible. When we take a no-dig approach, we're doing a few things. We are reducing the need to weed, because when you till and dig, you're unearthing weed seeds, bringing them to the surface where you're giving them the perfect conditions to grow. And you're protecting the soil ecosystem. There's a fabulous underground superhighway that connects plants and microbes and plants to other plants. Plants communicate with each other through fungi, through these mycorrhizal fungi that exist in soil. 90 to 95% of plants form these mycorrhizal relationships with plants. And I'm sure some of your listeners have heard like The Secret Life of Trees or read that book called The Mother Tree. I might be getting the name wrong, but it talks about these very things, how trees communicate. And it's not just trees, it's plants in general. And they're using this underground superhighway. And then going back to what we were talking about before, when we foster soil ecology, we're fostering biodiversity. And we also then have an opportunity to begin sequestering carbon underground, pulling it from the atmosphere back into the soil when we take this no-dig approach. And other tenets of regenerative growing, including going organic, avoiding the use of pesticides, herbicides, and synthetic fertilizers, protecting wild places. Wild places are reservoirs for biodiversity, doing no harm, and planting, again, biodiversity for biodiversity. That's really at the core of regenerative growing. And it's pretty simple. I mean, you think about how nature grows itself. Leaves fall to the ground. Animals do the work of decomposing those leaves. Moles burrow. Worms do their work. Birds move seeds about. I mean, there's no digging or tilling. And there's typically a biodiverse range of plants that foster biodiversity. And we're just doing the best we can to do exactly what nature's doing.
You were paid a very high compliment by our favorite retired college horticultural professor, Debbie Flower, when I was mentioning to her that I would be talking to you about regenerative gardening. She said, that is a very positive approach to take. It turns people on. It's something people can do in a positive vein, as opposed to taking a no-till approach, which is wagging your finger in front of people saying, don't till. On the other hand, you're saying regenerate your soil.
Yeah, regrow your soil and see your soil as this living organism, because it truly is. There's something really wonderful about that for us too. One of the questions I like to ask people is, when you were a child, you played in the dirt. Why did you ever stop? Not that person did. It's more of a rhetorical question, but there's something really magical about soil. And when you've ever smelled good soil or great compost, boy, doesn't it just light you up? Like, oh, and it might sound kind of strange and geeky to say that, but boy, there's something really wonderful about soil and being connected to soil and fostering good soil. And we know for a fact through research that having contact with soil helps your body to produce serotonin, which makes you feel better, increases your mood, decreases stress, does all these wonderfully good physical things for us. And it does great things for our gardens too.
In your book, Grow Now, you point out the regenerative gardening essentials, which include step away from tilling and take a no-dig approach, feed and protect soil with compost and organic mulch, keep living roots in the ground with cover crops and perennials, foster biodiversity by growing diversity, grow organically, say no to synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides, and celebrate living things and not only do no harm, but also do more good. Those are all very, very good points to make. Let's talk a little bit about the no-till, no-dig approach and how practical is that for a backyard gardener?
It's incredibly practical. You've been doing this for a long time too, so I'm sure you have some experience with this. But when you think about the effort it takes to till, and I was raised with my parents getting out the rototiller, and that's what you did when you first worked the soil to prep the space for a garden. I understand that is a place that many of us come from, and that's what we saw our families doing, or maybe we've done ourselves. I get it. But what I've learned is that it's not necessary, and it's actually beneficial to leave the soil as it is, and instead of digging down, layer up. That's really the idea, is to layer up. Take the tilling part, that bit of work out. Yeah, it's work to layer mulch and compost on soil. You can use a sheet mulching technique. If you're growing in the ground with perennial plants, for instance, and I'm doing this right now, I'm rewilding part of my front yard. The first thing I did, the front yard was an abandoned lawn. We bought this house that, I like to say it was a garden with a house attached. It's not a huge house. It's a 2-story house, so it looks big, but it's not. But it's on a half acre, which is more property than I ever imagined we'd have. And I was so excited, but at the same time, the house itself was move-in ready, which I was so thrilled about, especially during the pandemic when it was so hard to resource anything. It's like, thank goodness I don't have to remodel anything. We just painted a little bit. But the yard was a pile of deferred maintenance with plants, even such as poison hemlock were growing in the yard, and this old lawn that had, you should see the bindweed and the mallow and all these, plants with many of them with deep roots and thistles, and it's crazy what was there, and it was rock hard like concrete. And the first thing I did was use a no-dig technique of sheet mulching, which is simply, and you probably are familiar with this as well. I put out a layer of cardboard. I wet that cardboard, and then I covered it with compost.
I would think the first step you probably did, though, was either mow down or cut down any existing tall plants, especially the grass, in order to lay that cardboard down.
Yeah, typically that would be what you would do. But when I was starting, there wasn't any.
Oh.
It was early spring. It was March. It was a year ago. And weeds were starting to come up, but they were just more like a duff layer. It was more like winter had sort of done its work and everything had kind of died back into senesce, in a dormant stage. And I was lucky enough to get to this particular plot of earth before it went hog wild. But you're absolutely right. If you're working in a space where you already have tall grass, or you already have, especially woody plants growing that you want to cover, you want to cut them all really short and then put your cardboard down, wet that cardboard, and then put your compost or your mulch over the top. The area that I had the poison hemlock growing, I put cardboard down, and then I don't think I put any water on it because I didn't want to encourage any growth. I decided that nature and spring rains would do the work for me. And I put down a really thick layer of wood chips because I wanted to get rid of the poison hemlock without having to touch it. And I have a dog, and it's like, oh gosh, what if he's eating the grass next to the poison hemlock and gets a little bit by mistake? That would be a deadly mistake. So there's many different ways to use sheet mulching, but that's what I did for my front yard. And a year later, I'm planting in it. I could have planted in it sooner, but a year later, the soil is truly incredible. It is a beautiful, beautiful soil. And it's only getting better, and it's full of life. It's full of centipedes and worms and all kinds of things I can't see, and it smells great. And, it went from concrete to that in a year. But you can also plant in a sheet mulch situation right away.
We've been talking with Emily Murphy. She's the author of several garden books, including her latest, Grow Now. You can find out more information at her website, passthepistil.com, pistil being spelled Pistil. We learned a lot from you today, Emily. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for having me, Fred.
Garden Basics comes out every Tuesday and Friday. It's brought to you by Smart Pots. Garden Basics is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes Apple, iHeart, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, Google, Podcast Addict, CastBox, and Pocket Casts. Thank you for listening, subscribing, and leaving comments. We appreciate it.